Aye. Good morning and welcome. I'll declare the Corporate and Strategic Committee meeting of the 13th of June open. Now we have an apology for lateness from, do you want to weigh out first? I'll just get this out of the way. Thank you, Councillor. Just to let you know that Councillor Bevan is delayed by road closure, Napitalpa Road, and is coming via Palmerston North. He expects to be here around 10:30, and so there are some items we obviously need to include Peter in. So there may be some juggling around that. So we'll start off, I think, with Councillor Barker was going to give us a way outer. Is that correct?
No, you were opening it, so
I wonder whether Toro or Michael, who's the most senior here?
I'll refer to my tour.
Can we have your date of birth, please?
E karangana ki a koe te tika te pono te kororia e tīna te hārawa te matatu te whumai motinga kore. E karanga mātou hui mui a koe arena mātou koroho, ara mātou pātai, arena mātou whakaro, hei haere pai te tātou hui tēnei rā. Amen.
Amen.
Kia ora, thank you, Toro. So, again, welcome. Are there any notices? No notices. As I said earlier, an apology from Peter Bevan for lateness.
Is Councillor Wilson here today? Or?
Is he going to be late?
No, Fenton's absent.
Absent.
Yes.
Yes, an apology from Councillor Wilson, absent today.
I'll move the both
The apologies are moved by Councillor Barker. I've got a seconder. Thank you, Mr. Paku. All those in favour of those apologies being accepted will say aye. Those against will say no. They are accepted. Item 2 on the agenda is conflicts of interest. Are there any conflicts of interest? There are no conflicts of interest. We'll now move to the minutes of the Corporate and Strategic Committee of Wednesday, 14th of March. I'm assuming everyone's got a copy of those or had a chance to read them. Before we move to adopt those minutes, are there any matters that need amending? Councillor Belford. A reminder, councillors and Mr. Walker and Mr. Paku, that we need to actively press the button today. They're not automatic, unless you want it otherwise.
Hallelujah. I like that.
So on page 8 and then again on page 9, if you go to the bottom of page 8, the resolution 1.2.1, my recollection is that what was moved and carried was appointing Rex Graham, Peter Bevan, and Dan Druzianic as the board of directors of HBRC, not the chief executive.
We did appoint James, but then he subsequently declined.
No, I specifically moved 3 names. And the 3 names I moved were Rex Graham, Peter Bevan, and Dan Druzianic.
Councillor, given that Dan Druzianic was already a member, how does that transact?
Sorry, I'm not. I think that composition was finally determined at the subsequent council meeting.
Yes.
So at the last corporate and strategic, it was those 3, and then it was subsequently changed at the next council meeting.
Concur with that. I concur with that.
That's
All
my understanding.
right, okay. All right. Stand corrected?
No, you're right. Both were right.
just a different point in time.
Absolutely. All right, well, you're on that basis, and we're comfortable with the way the minutes are constructed there. Any other matters? Sorry, Councillor
On page 7,
Belford.
number 2, I believe it was Blair O'Keefe and Chris Tremaine, not Simon Tremaine.
Well spotted, Councillor.
Were we
Well
not selling the
spotted.
wharf?
So we've changed that, Madam Secretary.
Sorry.
Okay, given those amendments, adjustments, can I have a mover for those minutes to be accepted? Councillor Belford and Councillor Graham. All those in favour of adopting the minutes will say aye. Those against will say no. The minutes are adopted. Can we now move to matters arising? And
There's no matters arising on the agenda.
sorry, Councillor.
Only call up for items business not on the agenda, follow-up items.
I think, Councillor, it's a matter of custom and practice to consider matters arising. Thank you for your offering anyway. Are there any matters arising out of those minutes? You had the issue of the presentation of the Port of Napier annual result, and we will consider those other minutes in relation to Phase 2 Capital Structure Review Report, which will be contained in the public excluded minutes. And then we had the letter of expectation. Was that in public excluded? It was too. So those no matters arising from those. Can we now move to item 4, which is follow-up from previous corporate strategic meeting, and that is on page 3. Is there anyone going to speak to those, or are they self-evident?
I think they're all self-explanatory. Is there any questions?
Are there any questions on the matters arising? No questions in that regard. We'll now move to... yes, so do we need to receive those? Are they reports? What are they? Matters arising. Councillor Bailey will move those. Mr Walker will second them. Those in favour of receiving the follow-up items will say aye. Those against will say no. Carried. Moving to agenda item 5, which is the items not on the agenda. Are there any items not on the agenda that you would like to place there, please, today? No additional items. That's good to hear. We do have our workshop. We do have our workshop scheduled, and perhaps we talk about when we might do that. Now, when should we consider that? Is there any ideas about
So,
that?
Chair, we should mention this in the apologies, but James and Rick and I are going to see the Minister at 2 o'clock. Is that the flight time, James, is it? So it means we have to leave here at half past.
1:15?
Correct,
1:15.
1:15 to leave here?
So there are a couple of items on the agenda that I think we all need to be here, and item 10 is one. If you could move that up, that would be good.
But are you saying then that we wait for Councillor Bevan for that item?
Oh, we don't need to, it's just that, well, we could. Yeah, if he's here at 10:30, that would be excellent.
So we've got the things that would be useful to have as many here as we can.
Yeah.
The discussion, or the workshop, the public excluded items we've got, obviously, and the appointments to Hawke's Bay Tourism Board of Directors.
Mr Chairman, out of curiosity, if it's not a rude question, can I ask who the Chairman and Chief Executive, which Minister they're going to see?
The Honourable Phil Twyford, the Minister of Transport, to discuss the Port of Napier capital transaction issues.
Thank you.
Just as a bit of background, we're just trying to get as many person-to-person chats so we don't get any surprises, whatever we decide, so they all just know.
All right, I think we can press on with particularly agenda items 6 to 9 and see how we get on.
Yeah.
So can we now move to agenda item 6, which is the recommendations to the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee, which is on page 9. James, do you want to...
Chair, in relation to item number 5, Water Management Internal Audit, the FAR Committee has requested a comprehensive report in relation to that item for the meeting on the 3rd of October, but you will recall that last week at the committee there was a request for a presentation today on a short overview of how staff are responding to the recommendations from the audit, and so we do have that presentation available now, which Liz can run through if the committee would like.
So just in regard to that, so you're talking about there are 2 5s. The one over the page.
Sorry, the
Water Management Internal Audit. That's on page
correct.
10.
Recommendation 5 in relation to recommendation.
So under the recommendations, there is some additional information to present. But just before we go there, if I can get your agreement on agenda item 3, which is the living wage implication memorandum, which I hope you've read. If we could just leave that till last, deal with those other issues arising out of the subcommittee deliberations, because that's obviously a significant item for many of us here. So I wonder whether we can consider agenda item 2, which is procurement and contract management internal audit. And Liz, are you you've got some additional information on that?
No, Mr. Chairman. I haven't. Not on the procurement.
Oh, sorry, no.
No, it's on the water
Water
management
management, yes, I
internal
have,
audit.
yes.
Any comment at all on that procurement paper?
Not particularly.
No. Water management, we're up to that one now, Liz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee. So at the Finance, Audit and Risk Subcommittee meeting last week, one of the 2 audits that was considered by the subcommittee was in relation to water management, and the subcommittee requested that some additional information be brought to the full committee, given that there's only sort of 4 of you on the subcommittee, and the purpose of this is to really familiarise the rest of you with what was looked at. So the review was undertaken, or the audit, beg your pardon, was undertaken by Crowe Horwath, and the purpose of the review was really to look at the policies, procedures and controls that we have in place around our water management to meet the objectives of the Regional Resource Management Plan. So really looking at how we consent and monitor compliance with some of the key consents that we do issue. And the focus was very much around the 3 water services, so the supply of drinking water, the discharge of waste, both human and industrial waste, and discharge of stormwater. So those services are provided to their communities by our 4 territorial authorities. So that's really, if you like, the basis of the review. There were 4 groups of findings, and I am going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail for you, but just at a high level, they ended up with 12 recommendations altogether, and they were graded high, moderate or low by Crowe Horwath in terms of the importance of their impact and the recommendation and importance of their implementation. 2 of them were rated high out of the 12. 2 of them were rated low, and the rest were moderate. But they're basically under those 4 groupings, and I will go through each of those. But before I do that, just really a couple of a couple of slides that I've got that again came out of the discussion that was held last week, and it was really around members understanding the organisational structure of how council works, because the review actually looked at not just the consents and compliance, but it also looked at the science team in relation to their role around this key water management. So I've just got 3 of the new charts that we have up, new organisational charts. I've got three groups to show to you. And the reason I just wanted to show to you was, as much as anything, the new staff that are going to be employed now that you've worked through the draft long-term plan, but certainly the ones around science and environmental information. That's a key part of any criteria when we're looking at our decision-making on consents, when we're looking at, more particularly at the start of the whole process, the development of policy and the writing of rules. It's what we know and understand the resource to be like. And so we've got some new staff working in the science area. In Tom Skirman's strategic planning group, water quality and ecology, sorry. In Tom's strategic planning group, you'll see right over on the left, there's 2 more senior planners coming in, so that highlights your desire to really get those plan changes coming through as efficiently and as effectively as we can, to be able to implement a number of national standards and national policy statements. And then finally, in my new group, the regulation group, you'll see quite a few, pink or red, depending what you call that colour, new roles which are very much focused around increasing our capacity to monitor what is happening. So particularly in the compliance section, you'll see a new full-time environmental officer on pollution response, so our 0800 number. But you'll also see there, quite critically, 2 new staff that will be devoted to the compliance, the monitoring of compliance with resource consents. And the other key role that I wanted to highlight is over on the far right. It's a brand new role. It's called Principal Advisor Policy Implementation. Now, the rationale for that is very much around someone having an overview of what council is required to do when we bring forward a plan change. So not just what a consent holder is required to do, but also making sure that we meet our own timelines in relation to implementing plan changes, and having someone that can look at what's coming down the track from a national perspective and identifying where we may need to refocus our resource if there's a new national environment standard comes out, for example, or if we need to add additional resource. Someone that's just keeping an eye on all the moving parts and can advise us all in a very coherent way. So given that that's the new structure, just one more thing before I do go through the recommendations, and that's just to remind you that about a year ago, maybe 13 months ago, you approved funding for a new documentation system that we've called IRIS, which is Integrated Resource Information System. And since that time, a number of staff have been working, in addition to their day jobs, they've been working in a very committed way on getting this up and running. And there's a number of work streams in council that will be hooked up to the IRIS system. The first ones are the consents and compliance, and we're looking for that to go live by November of this year. The benefits of it include helping us with our current and expected increased workloads, having more efficient, immediate and accurate data capture, better workflows and more integrated information. And the reason I really wanted to remind you of that particular program is that a number of the recommendations from the audit will actually be able to be implemented as soon as we push the button on IRIS. So it's very much around recognising that what you've already provided for the council, for staff in terms of both human resources and other types of resources are going to help significantly in meeting the recommendations that the auditors have made. So here we are in table form. The recommendations that have been made. As I said earlier, there are 12 broken into 4 groups. The first one of those is around testing and monitoring. You'll see the 2 high ones, 2 high ratings are both in this first slide. The first one of those is recognition that there's an uncertainty over the who has responsibilities under the National Environment Standard for drinking water. And some description in that, in the full copy of the audit, around the joint working group establishing responsibilities and developing appropriate procedures for managing, monitoring and reporting on the impact of activities. And our comment there is this is very much a key priority for the joint working group, for their work program. So for each of those agencies, the joint working group includes us, it includes TAs, it includes the District Health Board. Everyone understanding the role that they've got to play. For us, it's very much around being a part of that multi-barrier approach to source protection, and we'll do that as we go through each of the plan changes, with the first one being noticeable when you look at the tank plan change. I'm not going to go necessarily through each of those, but I will highlight again the high one there, the formal adoption of a risk monitoring program. So what that is about us classifying which consents are more high risk than others, and therefore adapting our compliance activities to recognise that risk. Now, internally, we have that program, but the recommendation is that this be formally adopted, and so we'll be presenting that to you for adoption in the first quarter of next year. And just one other thing, I have changed the terminology. The audit kept referring to the resource use manager role and the resource use team, which is Wayne Wright's team. Under the new structure, we've renamed it, gone back to the old naming of compliance, because in effect that's really what they do, and I think that's easier for people to understand. There are again some recommendations around resourcing to be able to implement the risk monitoring program, and we've acknowledged there that since this audit was completed, obviously we've gone through the draft long-term plan, you've made your deliberations and have provided resources for us. We're currently equipped to monitor all our priority 1 consents anyway, and that includes all the territorial authority consents. But this allows us to be able to go wider and deeper into the monitoring. Testing results. There's one of the recommendations there which was outdated when they wrote it, because we've been doing the work since December of last year. However, they still chose, despite us advising that, to include it, so we have noted that it's already being done. And then you'll start seeing a number of comments on a number of the recommendations now really about IRIS and how that, being a much more automated system than we currently have, and with a far wider functionality, is really going to be able to help us implement almost all the remaining recommendations that the audit has made. There's some again around compliance and enforcement. We do now have representatives from Wairoa and Central Hawke's Bay District Councils on the joint working group. We've always had the politicians at a committee level, but we now have the second tier managers there on the joint working group, which is great. And again, a couple of other recommendations that are around internal processes, which are going to be implemented. And then the final one is about reporting, and this is really about reporting from the compliance manager, i.e. Wayne, through to the exec via me. And again, this is another one where we're going to be able to much more easily program effective regular reporting with the assistance of the IRIS program. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Liz. Before asking for other comment, my comment on this is congratulations to the staff for putting together a structure that deals with probably, I think, the most important function of the organisation. It's really the engine room, and I'm pleased to see the audit report that we produced has highlighted some steps and actions, the long-term plan does, and now we've got a really comprehensive structure. Pleased to see the tidy up of the names, sending me demented trying to read those. If you've got an opportunity to go back over that audit report, I recommend doing so because to me, as I say, it's critical. The other aspect we did as the Finance and Audit Risk Committee was to ask for a further audit to be done in the first quarter of next year. So a year after implementation of that new structure, we'll come back and examine it again. I asked the question earlier to James about where forestry sat in that equation. So much more rapidly now, we're experiencing situations where our consenting and compliance environment is becoming under more and more scrutiny, and obviously with the Gisborne flooding scenario, we're needing to address that, not only Havelock North water or stormwater, etc. Right across that becomes clear what our high-level responsibilities are to compliance. So pleased to see that structure in place. Are there any comments around that, Toro?
Yeah, I'd like to congratulate the team on actually putting this together. It's very timely and it's something we really need. But what I've got a question about is some clarity in terms of the issue about responsibility. I believe that there's been too much sidestepping on this issue in the past, and it's probably why we've got ourselves in the situation we have. I think the resource management talks about effects, so I think in terms of that aspect, we need to take responsibility because of the effects on our ratepayers.
Any other comments on that, Councillor Graham?
I was going to say I feel like the little old lady in the meeting at the Lieutenant from Mariah yesterday, but I won't. So this group, because it's great, but it's all words, So a little bit to Toro's point. So is this group going to come up with recommendations? Like, for instance, we still have stock grazing in paddocks close to where we get our water. And I don't know, it's time, but the whole issue around those wells, shallow wells, with stock right next to it, it's like we're in third world. So, will this grow? Don't answer so quickly, Liz, you're bound to answer me, but, are we going to come up with hardcore recommendations from this group that says this is the way we should be managing our water?
The short answer to that is no. And the reason for that is because that's not the role of that group. That what you've just described is the role of our plans, and it's the role of regulation in its broader sense. So the thing we can only implement and monitor what we're given control over by the plans, which ultimately goes back to you as the plan makers. So when there is, and I'll say when, regulation around stock exclusion, then we can act, but we can't act if there's nothing to back us up. Do you see what I mean? I mean, we need formal policy to be able to act in under the RMA and in this particular way.
Look, I'd just add that the source protection zones of drinking water supplies is an issue that's been worked on the tank plan change, for example, which is picking up on precisely the issues that arose in Havelock North. That'll translate through to regulation in the form of the plan change, and then this is something that then our consents and compliance staff can then more effectively implement. So what we're building here are the resources and the systems to implement a much greater level of regulation than we've previously done. So this is the back end of the stuff that you're doing at the tank table and doing at the regional planning committee table. So we know that there's going to be more regulation, and we're building our capability to ensure that we can deliver that for you.
Surely since the Resource Management Act came into effect in 1991, and there were obligations in terms of avoiding and mitigating, why haven't we actually got to the point of avoiding and mitigating all these things?
Well, look, I'd make the observation that regional councils around New Zealand are on a journey of becoming more active regulators. You're absolutely right. All the powers have been there since 1991, but the community, via its elected representatives, has not wanted to interfere in the activities of private landowners, commercial operators, and it hasn't been willing to regulate economic activities, particularly in our rural environment, with high and prescriptive levels of regulation. That's all changing. It's a national trend, and we're part of this journey of a more active protection, if you like, of the environment. So this is what all this long-term plan and all this additional resourcing is all about.
Thank you. Councillor Bailey, I'll come back to you, Councillor.
You've got a question. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. My question is, I think the audit's great in terms of it's pointed out a number of shortcomings that we have to fill, and we're going through and doing that, which is the intent of audits, obviously. But my question sort of builds on a bit from what Councillor Graham was talking about in terms of, and I appreciate why we can't do things now because there's no plans in place, like we haven't got the regulations in place. But is there any reason why we can't go out and start educating the people who are going to be affected as these plan changes come through about what their likely responsibilities are going to be? Because we might as well start the ball rolling.
I completely agree, Councillor, and I guess to a large extent we have set the ball rolling in terms of Plan Change 6 and the farm environment management plans. That's that the landowners in the Tukituk catchment are required to have, and so that's a very much a new way of operating for those landowners, and it's a regulatory requirement now, but we're going to hold them to that as well. So there is. As we move through geographically through the region, as we move over temporarily, we will see those behaviours change, and we will, in the case of Plan Change 6 or the Tukituk catchment, we're now in a position to act in a more regulatory way. In the case of other catchments throughout the region, our integrated catchment advisors will be saying to these people, look, this is coming your way, this is what you need to start thinking about, so that education part of it's going on as well. But for those areas, we don't have the regulatory backup right now. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Barker.
Thank you. I just want to respond to what I think is the essence of the question matter raised by Toru next to me, in that what we're watching here is another part of a shift in the way in which we manage things in New Zealand. Prior to the Resource Management Act, people owned land as owners with all the rights of ownership. The Resource Management Act changed that to mean that people were custodians of property. That was the very fundamental intent of it. But New Zealand never changed overnight because the Governor-General signed a piece of paper to say that was a new law. And the people who wrote it and the politicians who implemented it knew this was going to take time until people adjusted to what the new framework was going to be. And what you're witnessing with this is that continual adjustment to the fact that we are saying you are stewards rather than owners. And that's the clear impression, underlying principle of the farm management plans in Plan Change 6. If you'd put this up in the 1950s, there would have been complete outrage because you were interfering with our property right. Now, people accept that they are custodians. This is a significant shift.
Thank you, Councillor Barker. Councillor Belford.
I'm more concerned with the recent history in this area. It took me almost an hour to read this report because I fell asleep 3 times. To me, if you think back about 2 or 3 Environment Committee meetings, we had a report for the first time. Well, we had a report, and then we raised questions about that report and had an even fuller report on compliance. And it was the first ever a report. Here's the nature of the complaints we receive. Here's what we're doing with them. Here's the disposition of them. Here's some of the numbers involved. Here's the severity of them, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that was about 100 times more valuable than this report because it actually dealt with what's going on out there. Subsequently, I published a picture of one guy dumping concrete in the Clive River on a social media site. It got 45,000 views and a lot of comments from people saying, this is, whose fault is this? Who's watching over this? This is probably a council truck, et cetera, et cetera. And I still don't know what has happened. I don't know what the disposition of that is. 45,000 people don't know what the disposition of that is. That's, to me, what the compliance issue is all about. I have no idea what this, is fine, I'm glad somebody made some money putting this report together, but the rubber meets the road when we are looking at actual complaints and whether we are perceived to be responding to those actual complaints and actual episodes. And so for my money, having a regular, I forget what we decided in terms of the frequency of that, whether it was once a year, twice a year, maybe it was, I'm not sure how often we decided we wanted to get a report like that. But I think that goes a lot further to establishing that we're on the job than something like this does.
Chair, if I could just briefly respond. So look, the councillor is quite correct that there is an operational overview of our compliance and enforcement activity, which is now regularly scheduled for the Environment and Services Committee. That is because the Environment and Services Committee is the committee that oversees council's operations. The matters before us are systems and process issues, which is what the audit has focused on. So they are complementary, and I think what Mrs. Lambert was outlining is the improvement in the systems and processes that we have in place to not only monitor the consents and compliance activity, but also to report more effectively and in real time, so that the reporting that will go to the Environment and Services Committee will give a more up-to-date and more accurate snapshot of how we're managing risks around compliance. And with respect to the particular incident that the councillor has raised, that has resulted in a prosecution, which is presently working its way through the Environment Court. And I'm unclear as to why that's not known by councillors. I guess it's we just haven't made any media statement on that, and we don't usually do so until we get a result from the court. So our usual practice would be to issue a media statement at the point that the court has ruled favourably in terms of a prosecution and delivered an outcome. So that particular issue is continuing to work its way through, and the council will be receiving an update in due course. I don't know whether it's the next Environment Services Committee or the one after that, on our compliance activity overall. But as Liz said in the presentation, we're also, I think it's that last item up there, I'm expecting that the executive will get far more regular reporting on our consents and compliance activity, and that will be built into an overall organisational report that the council will receive on a monthly basis across a whole range of operational metrics once we get that.
Thanks, James, and fully expect the Environment and Services Committee to ensure that these issues reach council. I look forward to that report.
Can special attention be given to the forestry slash issue? We don't want a repetition in our region of that.
Well, just before you do, Councillor, what I'd hope to do was to unpick two other issues before we actually move to the recommendations. And one is we've got two items: the living wage discussion to have, and a quick overview of the Napier Port valuation. So if you could bear with us on those two issues. Now, committee members, we've got a paper you would have seen attachment 2 at page 38, which is the report, the Crowhorwath report, detailing the living wage implementation issues, and the FARC committee had a very robust discussion on this, and I do want to give plenty of opportunity for particularly Councillors Bailey and Barker to express their view around this. So I wonder, I'm assuming everyone's read that paper at some length, and I suspect the issues are well canvassed already. So I wonder whether we just take either questions or comment from Councillor Bailey and Councillor Barker, and then open it up for other councillors. Is that how you'd like to play that
Sorry,
one?
which report are you referring to?
So we're talking about the living wage, Councillor, and it's page 38 in the attachments, attachment 2.
In the attachments, yeah.
Yes. So that's the full report. Were we seeking, I can't remember whether we were seeking any additional information. Councillor, can you recall if we were seeking further information for this committee today? Can you remember what it was?
Thank you, Chair.
It was just the...
Oh, the additional commentary you'd requested, that's right.
As far as I'm aware, I expressed disappointment with the content of the original memorandum that came to, or the original paper that came to the subcommittee, because it hadn't set out the benefits of a living wage program for Hawke's Bay or for the community. But that's now been included in the recommendations here, so I'm happy with that. That's covered that off. So thank you, Jessica, for doing that. But I do have a question with regards to the recommendations.
So we'll come back in it when we go to the recommendations.
Well, I suppose it is a question which will help assist me to come to a decision.
Councillor Barker, were you wanting to have a comment at this point?
I'd rather have a debate with the question. I started on this
All right. So in terms of unpicking it, we're okay. We'll deliberate when we come to the. We'll take that as a separate recommendation when we come to that. You're okay with that?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. But I'd like to say I do have one question around the wording of the recommendation. That's all.
Sure. Okay.
Well, hopefully, because 4.2 requests that staff amend council's procurement policy to give weighting to contractors, so on. Can you just explain to me the significance of the word or the words "give weighting"? What the intention is there? Because I would have thought something a little stronger may have been required.
Sure, I think the intention is that we'll bring the procurement policy back to this committee for review and input. So it was around taking into account giving the living wage some kind of weighting. I don't think we have determined what that weighting would look like as yet, so we need to work through amending the procurement policy to incorporate that, and probably have some discussion around what we think is an appropriate weighting to allocate to that particular aspect of a tender.
Could we have some very moderate wording that strong preferences be given to employers who pay the minimum wage, and employers who are refusing to pay the minimum wage are treated as exploiters?
The minimum wage or the living wage? The living wage.
Living wage. No, anyway. Minimum wage. No, I just think you could have the preference be given to people paying the living wage rather than what have we got here? I thought it was really weak. They run around that 10 times without blinking. Waiting. So it's a preference. Waiting. So you can weight it negatively or you can weight it positively.
So to be
waiting is a dead duck word. I could run rings around you on every term on that and get you 20 answers without having to. So it's a preference is what we want.
Councillor, I think the point is that we're just wanting to signal this will not be the only consideration. So with respect to weighting, it is one of a number of considerations. So to say we would give a preference to somebody who pays the living wage is overly bald, I think, in terms of saying that that would be it may imply it's the predominant factor. The idea was saying, so positive weighting, absolutely. I think we can just clarify that it's not any kind of weighting, it is a positive weighting, but
you just put weighting in here. I had the read.
Well, let's just park this for a moment, councillor, and when we come to the recommendations, you could perhaps do an amendment at that point.
Mr Chairman, do you want someone to move these recommendations to make a bit of progress?
No, thank you, councillor. Councillor Hewitt has got a question.
Thank you, James. I appreciate the sentiments around the living wage that is coming around the table. When you look at the reasons behind it, it includes mortgages and all sorts of home expenses. So what will be the implications for council employing students over summer holidays, for instance, and will this be a disincentive for the staff, for the opportunities of employing students?
Oh, look, I don't think so. When we determine what is the Hawke's Bay living wage, I anticipate it will be lower than the national living wage on the basis that the national figure will be weighted upwards because of the Auckland costs of living, and Hawke's Bay may be slightly cheaper. That will take us closer to $20 an hour, I suspect, and that's the level at which we're paying students now. So I think we can accommodate students within the living wage policy. What I'm less clear about are what are the implications for our procurement of third-party services and how adding this in as a weighting into the criteria may have some upward effect on the cost of procuring some of our services, but that's something we'll need to consider in the fullness of time.
Councillor Dick, I wonder whether you'd be in a position to move recommendations 1 and 2.
I'm quite happy to move 4.1, 4.2,
Sorry, no.
4.3 and 4.4.
No, if we go back, councillor, recommendations 1 and 2, are you
1 and 2, yeah,
yes.
sure.
All right, so we've got a mover for recommendations 1 and 2. I've got a seconder for those, councillor Belford. All those in favour of those recommendations will say aye. Aye. Those against will say no, and that's carried. We now move to recommendation 3 and 4. Do I have a mover for those? Councillor Bailey or Councillor Barker?
Well, I'm opposed to 4.4.
I'll move.
Okay, well, Councillor Dick has moved recommendations 3 and 4. Is there a seconder for those recommendations? Please. Councillor Hewitt. So we have a mover and a seconder. Any comments, please, on those recommendations?
Well, Mr Chairman, I've got the right
yes.
to speak, I believe. However, I'll reserve that if Councillor Bailey wants to jump in.
Councillor Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I have a challenge with 4.4 in terms of undertaking an exercise to determine Hawke's Bay's living wage. I think that sends a message that we're quite happy for Hawke's Bay to be a low-wage economy, and that's not particularly where I want to see Hawke's Bay be. I want to see us on an equal footing in terms of the ability of people here in Hawke's Bay to earn good money. So I find myself having to oppose 4.4.
Do you want to separate that out, councillor, or what's your intent?
That would probably be helpful, Chair.
So would you be comfortable just to leave 4.4 as treat that separately, councillor?
Yes, as long as I've got my speaking right.
Yes, you do. All right. So we've got in front of us recommendations 3 and 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3. Those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
Those against will say no. That's carried. We now move to recommendation 4.4. Those in favour will say aye.
No, sorry, I haven't spoken
Oh,
yet.
sorry. Sorry, apologies, councillor. Yes, you want to speak.
I'll speak now if that's okay with you. Mr Chairman, I felt that it was appropriate to have 4.4 added in. It wasn't in the original recommendations. And the reason I felt it was appropriate was that clearly there's a significant margin and difference between the so-called living wage, which is largely influenced by the high cost of living in Auckland and other parts of the country. And on pages 54, 55, in the attachment, it reveals the different approaches that different authorities have taken, and a large number of them have chosen to assess a living wage for their particular region. If one does not do so and simply adopts the living wage as based on a national formula, then it is going to add cost to this council. And I'd remind people that it's not our money we're dealing with, it's other people's money. And it will particularly pose problems for industries such as the hospitality industry that has many younger and part-time workers, and which faces competitive pressures and stresses. And I know from my own experience that one has to be reasonable and pragmatic about that. And my background is in small and medium business over the years, in fast foods and hospitality and the motor industry and in commercial real estate. And the reality is, in the real world out there, and particularly in Hawke's Bay, then there are market pressures that have to be responded to. Now, that's not saying that I disagree with the concept of a living wage. I applaud it, but I believe it's got to be set at a reasonable level that actually reflects the cost of living in Hawke's Bay, rather than being influenced by the high cost of living in places like Auckland. So I would hope that councillors and others will recognise those economic and market realities in making a progressive move to a living wage, but having that living wage being assessed on the realities of Hawke's Bay, not Auckland.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other comments for or against the recommendation? Mr. Paku.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any movement that recognises the rights of individuals and whānau to have a standard of living where they're able to enjoy the basics in life that many people take for granted is a positive thing. I look back to the last statistics of 2013, where the average wage for Māori was less than $20,000. The average wage for Māori was less than $20,000. So there were a lot of people living way below that $20,000. And so, although I understand certain councillors' views in regards to wanting to see us head towards the national level of a living wage, any movement towards that living wage, even at a regional level, would have huge benefit to Māori. And for me, it's about this organisation, this regional council, taking the lead in that, along with other organisations. For my own organisation that I chair, the Tai Whenua Heretaunga, it is still an aspiration for us to move towards the living wage, even at a regional level. But we have been able to move away from the minimum wage. So it is a slow grind up. For me, it's about upward movement. Really, that's the most important thing. As a region, if we continue to move up towards a livable wage, because there are many families out there who struggle on a weekly basis just to have the basics in life, let alone the opportunity of a livable wage. Kia ora.
Thank you, Mr. Paku. I'll now, Councillor Barker.
I'll speak against this. with no disrespect to the intent behind this, I find this slippery talk. We have established a process by which we have set a New Zealand-wide living wage, which is, let's get the figures on the table, $20.55 at the moment, $20. The minimum wage is $16.50. So what we're talking about here, we're trying to find ostensibly somewhere between this is a portrayed grossly inflated living wage because of Auckland at $20.55. Hello, it's not big, and $16.50. Well, it's $4. Now, let's just take the fact that we would commission a report to establish for our own purposes, no one else's, this council's own purposes, what was the living wage here in Hawke's Bay? Well, we employ a consultant, an economist. They go through and do all the research. If you got that report for under $200,000, I'd be amazed.
Right. Rubbish.
$200,000, do a proper, robust report. Divide that by the $4 and it's 50,000 hours.
20,000.
Well, that's on the back of a bloody envelope. There's no value in that.
All
Just we're going to spend all this money just simply to try and figure out whether we're somewhere between $16.50 and $20.50. Who believes $20.55 an hour is an excessive pay rate? I can't find anybody who say it's excessive. It's not. The fact is we've got a minimum wage which is so low, and all we've done is chase ourselves down to the lowest bottom. And quite right, people can't live on $16.50 an hour. Cannot live on it. There's all of the signs around that we have got an impoverished society here. When was it that New Zealand was so mean and miserable? I never grew up on a miserable, mean New Zealand, but we've become one. And I don't want to be associated with a mean, miserable thing. If we're going to employ people, we should pay them properly. At $20.55, I would say, is still a low rate. And I think we should just front up and say, regardless of it, we have moral obligation here to pay people properly, and that's the end of it. $20.55, get on with the job.
Pleased to be able to stir you up this morning, Councillor. Any other comments? Councillor Graham.
Just picking up on both those points, $16.50 an hour is, if you do 2,000 hours, which you do if you have a full-time job, is $33,000 a year. And Mike's point is a lot of people who get that $16.50 don't get the 2,000 hours, and so if they get half that, they get $15,000 a year, or if they work in a seasonal operation, they get nowhere near the 33. And I would defy anyone in this room to think they could live on $33,000 a year salary, because that's what it equates to. It is low, and I don't think any of us in our personal lives are paying this kind of sum. All the really smart thinkers in Hawke's Bay are paying a lot more. Mainfreight just came out recently and said they're going to pay well in excess of the 20. No one on their staff is going to have be on the minimum, or going to be on the living. They're going to pay higher. So if commercial companies like Mainfreight, who tend to be very leading the way on these issues, if they can do it, we can do it as well. And I think we need to put pressure on some parts of our community to say, let's at least get to the living wage. Because it's not even that is $40,000 a year, and I don't think anyone around this room would think they could do that very well either. As if you get the 2,000 hours.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm assuming that's... did you want to write a reply? I didn't give you one, Councillor. Would you like one?
Well, I'd just like to reiterate that A, it's not our money, and B, it is appropriate to be to be just and fair, and to have an upward movement of wages within this region. But it's also vital that this council is a facilitator of economic progress and not a handbrake. And minimum wage set at the Auckland influence level is going to pose some problems for subcontractors, and certainly it's going to pose problems in the hospitality industry And of course, in a separate resolution relating to Hawke's Bay tourism, it put the obligation on them to attempt to have their members subscribe to the Auckland-based minimum wage. A regional minimum wage will probably be not much less than the $20 odd, and it will be a movement forward and upward, but one that will not pose excess economic stress. And I had something else that was particularly important, but it's slipped my mind, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor. Look, I'll put the recommendation. All those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
All those against will say no. Aye. Can we have a show of hands for that, please? All those in favour will raise their hand. It's 2, 4. Are those against will say raise their hand. I think the recommendation is lost. I want to now move to recommendations 5, 6 and 7. Do I have a mover for those? Do you have a question, Councillor?
With the Napier Port valuation, when the auditor comes to you and says, why did you choose that, what will your answer be?
So Council will be aware that we've had some recent work undertaken by the port looking at its own, the value of its own assets, work that's been done by Flagstaff partners in the first instance, but has also been peer reviewed by various folk, including PwC, as part of the Capital Structure Review and reviewed itself by the Capital Structure Review panel. The view of staff was that recent work to value the asset was sufficient at this point in time to roll over the current asset valuation in the balance sheet, particularly with a view to more work being necessarily done as part of the capital transaction in the fullness of time. So given that there will be a substantive body of work probably in the fourth quarter of this calendar year, in relation to any transaction, that will be the time to look at the valuation in greater depth. Does that answer the question, Councillor? Yep.
Any other questions on those recommendations? Well, I'll put those recommendations 5, 6 and 7. Did I have a mover? Sorry, no, I didn't. Start again. Sorry, Councillor Bailey moved. Seconder, got a seconder for those? No. Councillor Belford. All those in favour... Sorry, Councillor, do you want to speak to that? Councillor Bailey, do you want to speak? Yeah, Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you. I see that David Benham has resigned as a member of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee, and I'm sorry I didn't get to see him to say goodbye, but I just wanted to acknowledge the contribution he made when I was chair of that committee, and I think he's been a really good sounding board for this council. So I'm sorry to see him go, but I'm sure that appropriate thanks was made on the day as well. I was just wanting to acknowledge that as well.
Great point, Councillor, and yes, we did thank him. Perhaps we should write to him as well and do the same from the chair. That'd be good. Any other comment on those recommendations? Being none, I'll put the recommendations 5, 6 and 7. All those in favour will say aye. Aye. Those against will say no. Carried.
Just a small point. Could we send a letter of appreciation to David and thank him for his efforts?
We will do that, Councillor.
Just nice to tidy up. It's not in the recommendation, but doesn't need to be there. But a glowing letter from the Chief Executive or the Chair.
Yeah.
Did I miss that?
Councillors, we're now up to agenda item 7, and that is the appointment of an independent member to the Audit and Risk Committee. Now, is the Audit and Risk Committee a subcommittee or a committee? Can you just clarify that for me? It's a subcommittee, so the language in the recommendations is correct, that candidates shortlisted for interview by the subcommittee is the whole committee.
Recommendations to make some progress.
Sure. All right, so we've got the recommendations, page 14, 1 through 1, 2, 2.1, 2.2. Is there a seconder for those? Mr. Walker. We've got a mover and a seconder. I'll put the recommendations 1 and 2. All those in favour will say aye. Those against will say no. Carried. Move now to agenda item.
Could we postpone that until we've got it's from PwC?
Yes, so we've got someone coming from PwC to speak to that agenda item 8, draft statement of investment policy objectives and treasury policy. We can perhaps go to agenda item 9, which is the council representation review on page 19. Who's going to speak to this? Do you want to, Leanne?
Are you able to, Leanne?
Yes.
You do a better job than I will, I suspect.
Sorry, so I would like to prefer that the paper be taken as read and can respond to any questions. I do have a bit of an additional information, and that is the actual impact after having received the mesh block details from the Hastings District Council. So if you refer in the paper to where we've talked about the moving of populations from Lyndhurst, William Street, Howard Street, Iona and Tomato Hills into the more, I guess, what they're considered more urban sort of populations due to the way the development is going. I had a look at that with the actual mesh block maps, and I have a handout here that I'll hand around shortly. The actual impact is only 350 people out of the Naruroro constituency and into the Hastings constituency, because the first Lyndhurst, William Street, Howard Street, with the big population numbers, actually are already included in the Hastings constituency for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. So it's only affecting the Hastings District Council ward boundaries. So I'll take any questions.
Right, can you just, the ones that are already included in the Hawke's Bay Regional Council ones, the first three, 14, 2, 1, 2, 2 and 2, 3, is it?
That's correct, yeah.
But what you haven't told us here is what is the effect on the Hiratonga ward? So what does the numbers come down to? The things, the rest of the paper talks about balance between constituencies. So shifting some out of one into another. What your paper is deficient in is it doesn't tell us what is the net effect on the Hiratonga ward.
So if you look at the handout that I've just handed out, the actual updated stats for the
It's not in the paper here, but the handout tells
yeah.
us here. So,
yes.
Right, the handout brings us up to date. So is this correct that the Narura ward would be in the same proportion to the Hastings and the Napier constituencies approximately, within the margin of error?
Yes.
Okay. Now, your paper doesn't tell us why you think we should do this. You've just said because Hastings has done it. That's no reason. It's what is the rationale for this? What is going to be the plus and minus of this?
The rationale is that the Local Government Commission in their guidelines, asks that the regional councils make every endeavour to make their boundaries reflect those of the territorial authorities.
Thank you, but that's not in your paper. That's helpful. The third question I've got for you is, last time we went through this, we had a sequence of papers, all of which were disconnected. And we had a paper came on with this, and the paper with this, and the paper with something else. Now, what I want to know from you is, are there any sets of decisions which are coming subsequent to this, which might or might not have an impact or be influenced by these decisions?
So I've outlined the sequence of events in the paper under number...
19?
Yes.
I read that. My question still stands.
Sorry, can I ask clarification?
Last time we went through this, I
Yes.
remember we had a paper and we signed it off, and then sometime later you forwarded to the committee another paper, and it was in the first paper there was no indication that there was a subsequent decisions coming along which all were interconnected, and I expressed my frustration at the time that here we were being compartmentalised into making decisions, not realising what else is coming down the track. And I said at that time, I want, if we ever go back through this again, to make sure that all of the decision-making processes were clear, it's line of sight, so we knew when we were making one decision, what impact it was likely to have on another. My question is, are we in the same position we were before, or have you got all of these things set out in here, and we've got clear line of sight on what these decisions are and how they're impacting one on the other?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Next question. In Rec 3.3, you've written here, request the staff present proposals to council's consideration resolution of the 8th brick initial proposal public. What does that mean? What are we supposed to be presenting for? What direction are we giving you? What are we supposed to be doing here? It's unclear.
When I put this in here, it was as a matter of record of the, I guess the in-principle decisions going forward. So when council considered the paper at the corporate and strategic meeting in September, there was a direction from that committee that other than looking at the Māori representation, that the feeling at that time was that we stick with the status quo going forward. So what I've done here, by putting that in there, is indicated that, okay, well, that's the direction signalled from the council. So having gone through, subsequently through the recommendations from the Hastings and including those, is that taking into consideration council's signalled direction and then considering these other slight changes, which in accordance with the additional information I've just tabled, staff are comfortable that if that is still the wish of the council, that's what we go forward with.
Well, can I respond to that and say that that's what the resolution should have said, and this is what I understood, that we had a discussion previously that we're going to stick with the status quo. So I would have thought 3.3 requests that staff prepare proposals for council consideration based on the previous discussions the council had, that we maintain the status quo with the exception that we amend the boundary to accommodate the changes in the boundaries in Hastings. And that would have been a clear instruction. But that's what you're saying to me now in words, but it doesn't say that in the resolution.
I think we can just look to restructure that 3.3 a little bit to reflect. That's a good point, Councillor.
So that tells us what we're doing.
Exactly.
Which is what we should be doing.
Councillor Bailey.
Perhaps my memory needs refreshing, but when we're talking about keeping the status quo, I thought all we were discussing back in September was about the electoral system that we're using and not boundary changes. Or my memory's not serving me
It was electoral system and Māori seats.
Yes, it was.
So the Māori seats, was it? I don't, I
So
mean,
the boundary changes is today's item, so that's what's been
yeah,
incorporated here.
so I just want to be clear that when we're talking about status quo, this is not actually status quo. This is something completely different from what we've discussed already.
It's status quo in respect of those two prior matters, which is
Yep.
the electoral system and Māori seats.
Yep.
And as Councillor Barker just indicated, there are some changes to the boundaries which are proposed, so that would be part of what would be agreed upon in this revised resolution. And then the consultation document brought forward on the 25th of July would capture those elements.
Councillor Dick.
Yeah, Mr Chairman, I might have missed it in the earlier discussion, but what is the population effect of these changes in Hastings?
That's on that handout, Councillor, yes.
Oh, sorry,
It's
it's
a
on the
useful
other-
piece
on the
of
other side.
information, yes. So you see that at the bottom of the page, the implications for Narora, net minus 350 voters in that constituency.
So they're not material?
Well, it only shifts marginally the net result of 14.4%.
That's right, thank you.
Percentage difference. So I think, have you got some wording that you might be able to construct there, Madam Secretary? So we're just essentially looking at 3.3, requests that staff present a proposal for Council's consideration based on
September, whatever it was, 17 council decision and include the proposed boundary change to in Hastings.
The adjustment.
Comply with the blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
For the 25 July regional council meeting.
words to those effect. I think we've got the gist of that.
I'll move.
Do we have a seconder for that?
Second.
Councillor Dick, moved and seconded. Are there any other comments? Any other comments on the recommendations 1 through 3?
Just,
Mr. Paku.
just one. Once again, just to highlight my disappointment in that this discussion is not including Māori ward seats, but we understand the reason for that. I just wanted to put that to the record again. Thank you.
Any other comments? I'll put the recommendations and we'll just assume the adjustment that the Secretary will make to those. So recommendations 1 through 3. Those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
Those against will say no. Carried. I think we can move. We're 20 past. I think we could move to. So the statement of intent, we're still waiting for. Okay, so we're still waiting for that.
Certainly 10:30.
So we could go to the HBRC statement of intent.
Depends if you would like Blair present.
So it's a matter of Blair being present for that. And we're waiting for someone else on the.
What's wrong with item 10?
Sure, we can put item 10. Happy to do that. All right, we'll go to item 10. Council appointment to the Hawke's Bay Tourism Board of Directors. We've got the paper there. I'm assuming you've all read that, so unless there's any other earlier conversation, we'll go to the recommendations, particularly 1.2, nominating a councillor for appointment as Director of the Hawke's Bay Tourism Board of Directors as Council's representative to replace Councillor Fenton Wilson. Is there a nomination for that role?
Mr. Chairman, before you do that, could you or someone advise us as to why Councillor Wilson resigned?
Not in a position to do that.
I could make comment in relation to the resignation letter from Councillor Wilson. His wording, which I'm sure he would be happy to be conveyed to the committee, is that, quote, "I have been reflecting on the council decision to reduce Hawke's Bay tourism rate funding for the next 3 years. This is my second term as council representative. I've served 3 years in conjunction with the council chair roles from 2011 to 2013 and again now from 2016. As a vocal champion of the $1.8 million total as realised current financial year, I think it prudent I step down as the council representative on the board. This quantum has been challenging for council and maybe it's prudent to make way for another councillor in the role. I'm still pretty keen to be involved with tourism as it has been a raging success for the pragmatic council spend, but I realise new eyes representing council are important as we look to find new ways to fund the activity. I would be available to assist and support any appointment. I suggest a new rep could be appointed at the council meeting end of June. With this in mind, I'll stay on board through the next board meeting, which is in the next couple of weeks, to provide continuity for council. And that is from Benton.
Thank you.
Any other question? Councillor Hewitt.
I'm sorry to hear that. I know that Councillor Wilson worked really hard and was very passionate about that board. I'm wondering why we are not following through with the independent appointments policy to be putting somebody on this board, as we have in the past.
Well, I'm assuming Councillor Wilson wasn't the independent person.
With regard to nominating somebody else.
Is there a process outside of a councillor appointment?
My question's for James.
So my understanding is that this appointment, unlike some of the other appointments that we make to other organisations, is a direct councillor appointment, so it's by simple resolution of council, so we don't have a subcommittee process for that. And I don't believe that Councillor Wilson's appointment to Hawke's Bay Tourism was done in any other way other than by straight resolution of council. That's my understanding. We obviously don't call for expressions of interest from anybody outside of council for this role.
It's not a paid position, is it?
No, it's not.
No, but the HBRC councillor directors went through an independent appointments process, and in the last instance, the council voted to suspend that process. So why is it not consistent with the Hawke's Bay Tourism?
Because I absolutely recall, I think I nominated Councillor Wilson. This is a council appointee to an organisation which we fund substantially, and it came from council, and if you recall, Councillor Wilson said at the time that he was interested in doing that job, and it was supported by council, and I think I nominated him at the time.
Thank you. If there's no other questions in this regard, I'll call for nominations for a councillor appointment to Hawke's Bay Tourism. Is there a nomination? Councillor
I'd like to nominate Councillor Belford.
Councillor Belford. Is there a seconder for Councillor Belford? Councillor Barker. I've got one nominee for the nomination for this appointment. Is there another?
Well, even if there's not, can I politely ask Councillor Belford why he would want to do this position, seeing he has not been particularly supportive of Hawke's Bay Tourism in the past?
Well, in the first instance, it's up to Councillor Belford to respond, but in the first instance, I don't know if it's appropriate to challenge in that way and appoint a nominee, unless Councillor Belford's got something to say.
So, if we take a vote and then Councillor Belford could reflect on how he thinks he could contribute.
Sure. All right, so we've got a nomination. Are there any other nominations? There being no other nominations, what are we doing? We accept Councillor Belford as the nominee for the Hawke's Bay Tourism Board. So we've had a mover and a seconder. Those in favour of Councillor Belford will say aye.
Aye.
Those against will say no.
Against.
It's an against. Do you want that recorded, Councillor? No. So, oh, sorry, did you want to speak?
I wish to abstain actually because it is a council's decision, not members to this committee.
What's the...
So look, it'll be a recommendation from this committee through to council, so the council's full resolution on this or determination will be at the council meeting at the end of the month, and so So as a committee member, you can be party to making the recommendation.
So we now have a nomination, and I'm a little intrigued with the recommendations as they are, but recommendation 2 is that we now, this committee recommends to council that we appoint Councillor Belford to the Hawkesbury Tourism Board. I'm looking as though I'm needing a mover for that too, am I?
We can go with this one if we want to.
I think it's sufficient as is with that nomination, unless we'll take it as read. It's a recommendation to council. We're at close to 10:30.
Blair's advised he will be here at 10:30, so...
And do we want to break now?
We can. I was just going to let you know that Brett from PwC.
So we've got our PwC person here. Brett, welcome. But what do you think, folks? We have a cup of tea now. It seems like a good place to join. Yeah.